James Walker couldn't believe his eyes. Hidden in plain sight, behind the counter of his own retail store, was an employee berating a young mother trying to return a defective product. The mother, clutching a crying baby, looked humiliated as the employee raised his voice, calling her careless and unreasonable. Customers nearby watched, some whispering, but no one intervened. James's stomach churned as he saw the tears well up in the woman's eyes. "Look, lady, it's store policy. No receipt, no refund. I don't care what your excuse is," the employee barked. James, disguised in a simple baseball cap and a plain hoodie, felt his heart race. Should he step in? Would revealing himself now jeopardize his plan? He had come here undercover to observe how his employees treated customers, but this was beyond what he expected. As the young mother's shoulders slumped in defeat, James knew he had to act. But how? He was about to speak when, 2 weeks earlier, James sat in the expansive corner office of Walker Enterprises, sipping his morning coffee. The company had grown from a single mom-and-pop shop into a national chain of retail stores, thanks to years of hard work and innovation. But lately, something felt off. Customer complaints were piling up, employee turnover was unusually high, and profits at some locations were dipping for the first time in years. James, a hands-on CEO who prided himself on staying connected to the roots of his business, decided it was time to go undercover. He wanted to see the day-to-day operations of his stores without the polished presentations his managers always gave him. "Sir, I've prepared the quarterly report," his assistant Lisa said, interrupting his thoughts. "Thank you, Lisa," James replied, flipping through the document absent-mindedly. His eyes landed on a section highlighting store number 57, located in a bustling city neighborhood. The store was one of the top performers when it first opened, but had recently plummeted to the bottom of the rankings. "Schedule my visits to the stores for next week," he said, handing the report back to Lisa. "And don't tell anyone, not even the store managers. I want this to be unfiltered." Lisa raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Understood." James chose store number 57 as his first stop. He arrived early in the morning, blending in with the trickle of employees clocking in. He wore casual clothes, a far cry from the tailored suits he usually donned, and carried an old messenger bag instead of his leather briefcase. No one gave him a second glance. The store looked bright and welcoming from the outside, with large glass windows displaying colorful seasonal promotions. But as soon as James stepped inside, he noticed subtle signs of neglect. A flickering light above the entrance, unorganized shelves in the front section, and a faint musty smell near the aisles. A young cashier greeted him with a forced smile. "Welcome to Walker's. Let me know if you need anything." Her tone was flat, almost robotic. James smiled back and grabbed a basket, pretending to browse the aisles. He overheard snippets of conversations between employees, some joking about skipping work to attend a party, others complaining about rude customers. A supervisor yelled at a stock boy for being too slow, while the boy muttered something under his breath about being treated like garbage. James's chest tightened. He had built his business on the principles of excellent customer service and treating employees like family. But what he was seeing here was far from that vision. As the day went on, James quietly observed how the store operated. Some employees worked diligently, stocking shelves and helping customers, but they seemed overshadowed by others who clearly didn't care. He noticed an older employee, Mrs. Thompson, kindly helping an elderly man find the right brand of cereal. This is what it's supposed to look like, James thought, feeling a glimmer of hope. But just as he made a mental note to commend her later, he overheard a manager mocking Mrs. Thompson in the break room, calling her a dinosaur who can't keep up. It was clear that the store had a culture problem, but James wasn't sure how deep it ran. He decided to stay for a full shift to get the complete picture. By late afternoon, James had seen enough to feel uneasy, but not enough to fully understand the root of the problem. That's when the young mother walked in, cradling her baby and carrying a broken blender. The employee at the customer service desk, a burly man with a name tag that read Dan, immediately looked annoyed. "What do you want?" he asked without a hint of politeness. The woman explained that the blender had stopped working after just one use, and that she didn't have the receipt because it was a gift. She only wanted to exchange it, not get a refund. Dan rolled his eyes. "If you don't have a receipt, You're out of luck. It's not my problem, he said, leaning back in his chair. But it's a Walker's product, the woman pleaded. Can't you check your system to see if it was purchased here? Dan laughed. Do I look like I have time for that? The woman's face turned red as other customers began to watch. Please, I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just need a working blender to make baby food. James clenched his fists as Dan's tone grew louder. He could see the fear in the woman's eyes and the judgment in the customer's stares. He had come here to observe, but he couldn't stand by any longer. James stepped forward and said, Excuse me, what would happen next? Would James reveal who he was and risk blowing his cover? Or would he handle the situation differently to avoid suspicion? The store fell silent as James prepared to make his next move. James's heart pounded as every eye in the store turned toward him. Dan raised an eyebrow, clearly irritated by the interruption. The young mother looked at James, a mix of hope and desperation flickering across her face. Is there a problem here? James asked, his voice calm but firm. This doesn't concern you, pal, Dan replied, crossing his arms. I think it does, James said, meeting Dan's gaze without flinching. She's trying to return a defective product. Can't you at least check the system to confirm the purchase? Dan smirked and leaned against the counter. Listen, buddy, you don't know how things work here. Store policy says no receipt, no refund. End of story. James glanced at the mother, whose hands were trembling as she rocked her crying baby. You work in customer service, right? He asked Dan. Maybe it's time to show some service. The sarcasm in James's tone didn't go unnoticed. A few customers snickered, but Dan's smirk faded into a scowl. You got a problem with how I do my job? I've got a problem with how you're treating her, James shot back. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried an authority that made Dan hesitate. Dan's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, a manager appeared. Her name tag read Rebecca, assistant manager. She had an air of no-nonsense authority, but looked slightly frazzled as she approached. What's going on here? Rebecca asked, her eyes darting between Dan, James, and the young mother. This guy, Dan said, pointing at James, is trying to tell me how to do my job. James took a deep breath, deciding to play his role carefully. I'm just a customer, but I think it's only fair to check the system and see if her claim holds up. It's not like she's asking for anything unreasonable. Rebecca sighed, clearly annoyed. Dan, just check the system, she said, her tone clipped. Dan grumbled but reluctantly complied, punching a few keys on the register. After a moment, he let out a frustrated sigh. Fine. Looks like it was purchased here after all. Rebecca turned to the mother. We'll replace the blender for you this time, but next time, make sure to keep your receipt. Her tone wasn't as harsh as Dan's, but it lacked warmth. Thank you, the mother whispered, her voice barely audible. She clutched the new blender like it was a lifeline and hurried out of the store. James watched her leave, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. While the immediate problem had been resolved, the larger issue remained. The culture in this store was toxic, and it was clear that neither Dan nor Rebecca understood what customer service truly meant. Over the next few hours, James continued his observations, his mood oscillating between hope and dismay. He noticed small acts of kindness from employees like Mrs. Thompson, who helped the young boy find the perfect birthday gift for his sister. But those moments were overshadowed by incidents like the one he had just witnessed. James decided to test the waters further. He approached a young cashier named Emily, who looked barely out of high school. She was nervously ringing up items for a long line of customers. You're doing great, James said quietly as he placed a candy bar on the counter. Emily glanced at him, startled. Oh, thanks, she mumbled, blushing. Do you like working here? James asked, keeping his tone casual. Emily hesitated, then shrugged. It's okay, I guess. It pays the bills. James nodded, sensing there was more to her answer. Anything you'd change if you could? Emily bit her lip, glancing around as if worried someone might overhear. I mean, I wish people were nicer. Customers can be really rude, and some of the staff, well, you've probably seen how they are. James's chest tightened. Emily was clearly struggling, but she didn't want to say too much. He thanked her and moved on, feeling a growing resolve to address the issues he was uncovering. As the evening shift began, The store grew quieter, and James decided to stick around a little longer. He noticed Rebecca talking to another manager, a man named Todd, near the break room. They were discussing schedules, but their conversation took a turn when Todd mentioned cutting hours for some employees to save costs. "Dan's hours are safe, though, right?" Rebecca asked. "Of course," Todd replied. "He's one of our best workers." James nearly laughed out loud. Best worker? He couldn't believe what he was hearing. How could they not see the damage Dan was doing to the store's reputation? As he listened, James realized that favoritism and poor management were at the heart of the store's problems. Employees like Emily and Mrs. Thompson were being overshadowed by people like Dan, who thrived in the toxic environment. James felt a wave of anger, but he reminded himself to stay calm. He couldn't blow his cover, not yet. He needed more time to fully understand the dynamics at play. Just as James was preparing to leave, a commotion broke out near the electronics section. A teenage boy had been caught trying to steal a pair of headphones. Dan was the first to respond, grabbing the boy by the arm and yelling for security. "Gotcha, you little thief," Dan shouted, dragging the boy toward the front of the store. "Please, let me go," the boy cried, his voice cracking. Customers gathered to watch as Dan berated the boy in front of everyone. "You think you can just waltz in here and take whatever you want? Not on my watch." James's heart sank as he saw the fear in the boy's eyes. He couldn't stand by and let this turn into another spectacle. He stepped forward, placing a hand on Dan's shoulder. "Hey, take it easy," James said, his voice steady. Dan glared at him. "Stay out of this. This punk needs to learn a lesson." "I agree," James replied, "but humiliating him in front of everyone isn't the way to do it." Dan's grip on the boy tightened, and James could feel the tension in the air. The crowd was growing, and the situation was spiraling out of control. James knew he had to act quickly, but how could he defuse the situation without revealing who he really was? What would James do next? Would his intervention make things better or worse? The store was a powder keg, and one wrong move could set it off. James felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The teenage boy's eyes darted around, wide with panic, as Dan's grip remained firm. The crowd whispered among themselves, their murmurs fueling the tension. James stepped closer, keeping his voice calm but authoritative. "Dan, let him go. Security's on the way, right? They'll handle this." Dan shot him a glare, his chest puffed out like a rooster protecting its territory. "You don't know how things work here. People like him think they can just take what they want and get away with it. Not on my watch." James noticed the boy's lip quivering as tears pooled in his eyes. He couldn't have been older than 16. The headphones dangled from his pocket. Cheap ones, the kind someone desperate might steal. "Look at him, Dan," James said, his voice softening. "Does he look like a threat to you?" Dan's jaw clenched, but his grip loosened slightly. "That's not the point. Rules are rules. And the rule is to involve security, not manhandle someone," James countered. "You're not the law." Dan opened his mouth to argue, but Rebecca's voice cut through the air. "Dan, what's going on?" Rebecca strode over, her expression a mix of irritation and concern. She quickly assessed the situation and turned to Dan. "You can't be rough with a minor. Let him go. Now." Dan reluctantly released the boy, who stumbled back and pressed himself against a nearby shelf. Rebecca waved over the security guard, who had finally arrived. The guard, a middle-aged man with a kind face, approached the boy gently. "Come with me, son. Let's talk in private," the guard said, his voice calm and steady. The boy nodded, wiping his face as he followed the guard toward the back office. The crowd began to disperse, but James could still feel the tension in the air. He turned to Rebecca. "Do you really think this is how your store should handle things?" Rebecca narrowed her eyes. "Who are you to tell me how to do my job?" James forced himself to stay composed. "I'm just a customer who doesn't want to see kids dragged around like criminals. Maybe you should think about how this reflects on the store." Rebecca huffed, clearly unimpressed. "Thanks for your input. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have real work to do." As she walked away, James felt his blood boil. The arrogance, the dismissiveness. It was clear Rebecca was part of the problem. But as much as he wanted to confront her, he knew he had to bide his time. Later that evening, James lingered near the store's exit, watching as employees began to wind down for the day. The teenage boy, now visibly calmer, emerged from the back office with the security guard. James overheard their conversation as they walked toward the door. "Thanks for not calling the cops," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't make this mistake again," the guard replied gently. "Next time, ask for help if you're struggling." The boy nodded and hurried out of the store, disappearing into the night. James felt a pang of guilt. The kid's actions were wrong, but they were likely a symptom of something deeper, a reality James wanted to understand better. James decided to push his cover further the next day. Instead of simply observing, he planned to engage more directly with the employees. He arrived early, blending in with the morning shift as they clocked in. He struck up conversations where he could, asking questions about their experiences and challenges. Emily, the nervous cashier, opened up a little more. "It's just, some people here make it hard to enjoy the job, you know? Dan's always yelling, and Rebecca doesn't care unless it's about numbers." James nodded, encouraging her to continue. "And Mrs. Thompson," Emily added, lowering her voice, "she's the nicest person here, but they treat her like she's disposable. She's been here longer than anyone, but they cut her hours last month without even telling her why." James felt his stomach drop. Mrs. Thompson was a shining example of what he wanted his employees to be: dedicated, kind, and helpful. The thought of her being mistreated was infuriating. "Why do you think they cut her hours?" James asked. Emily shrugged. "Probably because she's not as fast as some of the younger employees. But she cares more about the customers than anyone else." James thanked Emily and moved on, determined to speak with Mrs. Thompson directly. He found her in the cleaning aisle, helping an older man choose a mop. Her gentle demeanor and patient smile were a stark contrast to the chaos he had witnessed the day before. "Excuse me," James said after the customer had left. "I just wanted to say I've noticed how kind you are to everyone. It's refreshing." Mrs. Thompson chuckled, her face creasing with warmth. "Well, thank you, young man. I just try to treat people how I'd like to be treated." "Do you like working here?" James asked cautiously. She hesitated, glancing around before answering. "I used to. This place was different when it first opened. Now, it's not as friendly as it used to be." James frowned. "What changed?" Mrs. Thompson sighed. "The management, mostly. They care more about the bottom line than the people who keep this place running." Her words stayed with James long after their conversation ended. He knew he couldn't fix everything overnight, but he was more determined than ever to make things right. Just as James was preparing to leave for the day, another commotion erupted, this time near the storage room. He rushed toward the noise and found Dan shouting at Emily, who was on the verge of tears. "I told you to restock these shelves an hour ago," Dan bellowed. "What do you even do around here?" Emily stammered, her voice trembling. I was helping a customer." "Excuses," Dan snapped. "You're useless." James felt his blood boil. He stepped forward, his voice sharp. "That's enough, Dan." Dan turned, his face twisting in anger. "Who the hell do you think you are?" James squared his shoulders, his patience finally wearing thin. "Someone who's not going to let you treat people like this anymore." The room went silent. Employees gathered, their eyes wide with shock. Dan glared at James, his fists clenched. The tension was palpable, and James knew he had crossed a line, but he didn't care. Something had to change, and it had to start now. Would James's confrontation with Dan escalate into a full-blown disaster? How would the employees react to this unexpected defender? The air was thick with anticipation, and James knew the next move could make or break everything. Dan's face reddened, his fists clenching as he stepped toward James. "You've been sticking your nose where it doesn't belong all day. Who do you think you are, walking in here and telling me how to do my job?" The employees gathered around, their murmurs creating a low hum in the background. Emily, still trembling, took a step back, her wide eyes darting between Dan and James. James remained steady, his gaze locked on Dan. "I'm someone who won't stand by while you treat people like dirt. This isn't how you talk to employees, or anyone for that matter." Dan laughed bitterly. "You think you know better than me? I've been here for years. I keep this place running, Is that what you think? James replied, his voice calm but cutting. Because from what I've seen, you're part of the reason this place is falling apart. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Dan's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. The other employees exchanged uneasy glances, some nodding subtly, as if agreeing with James, but too afraid to say it out loud. Rebecca arrived, pushing her way through the growing crowd. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her voice sharp. Dan pointed at James, his hand trembling slightly. "This guy's been causing problems all day. He doesn't even work here." Rebecca turned to James, her eyes narrowing. "Who are you? And why are you interfering with my staff?" James hesitated, knowing this moment could unravel everything. Revealing his identity now would jeopardize his undercover mission, but staying silent might cost him his credibility with the employees who were finally starting to pay attention. "I'm a customer," he said, his voice steady. "A customer who's spent enough time here to see how badly this store is being run." Rebecca's lips tightened. "You have no right to judge how we operate. If you don't like it, you're free to leave." James stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Rebecca could hear. "Maybe I don't work here, but I know a poorly managed store when I see one. If you care about your job, you'll listen." Rebecca blinked, taken aback by his confidence. Before she could respond, the sound of a crash echoed from the stockroom, cutting through the tension like a knife. Everyone turned toward the noise. "What now?" Rebecca muttered, hurrying toward the stockroom with James and the others following. Inside, they found Todd, the other manager, standing amidst a mess of toppled boxes and broken merchandise. He looked pale, his hand clutching his chest. "Todd," Rebecca called out, rushing to his side. "What happened?" I don't feel good," Todd managed to say, his voice weak. James's instincts kicked in. "Someone call 911, he said, kneeling beside Todd. "Are you having chest pain? Can you breathe?" Todd nodded faintly, sweat beading on his forehead. James glanced around at the stunned employees. "Don't just stand there. Get some water and clear a path for the paramedics." The employees sprang into action, and within minutes, the store was a flurry of activity. Emily brought a bottle of water, her hands shaking, while Mrs. Thompson guided customers away from the scene, her calm demeanor soothing their concerns. When the paramedics arrived, James stepped back, watching as they loaded Todd onto a stretcher. The room fell silent as the stretcher was wheeled out, leaving behind a shaken group of employees. Rebecca turned to the group, her face pale. "Everyone, back to work," she said, her voice lacking its usual authority. No one moved. James stepped forward. "You're in no position to brush this off, Rebecca. What just happened should be a wake-up call for everyone here." Rebecca glared at him. "And what exactly do you think we should do?" "For starters," James said, his tone firm, "you need to take care of your people. You can't expect them to give their best when they're treated like this. Look around you. Do you think anyone here feels valued?" The employees shifted uncomfortably, but James could see the truth in their expressions. Dan muttered something under his breath, but Rebecca silenced him with a sharp look. "You think you've got it all figured out, don't you?" Rebecca said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "No," James replied, "but I know enough to see this place needs a change. The question is, are you willing to be part of it?" Rebecca stared at him, her expression unreadable. The room remained tense, the employees watching her closely, waiting to see how she would respond. As the day wound down, James stayed late, helping Mrs. Thompson clean up the mess in the stockroom. She worked quietly, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "Thank you for stepping in earlier," she said finally, her voice soft. "Not many people would have done that." James smiled faintly. "It's the least I could do." Mrs. Thompson paused, her eyes thoughtful. "You remind me of someone I used to know. Someone who believed in doing the right thing, no matter the cost." James didn't reply, but her words lingered in his mind. As he left the store that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that his mission had only just begun. Would Rebecca take James's words to heart, or would she double down on her leadership style? And what about Dan? Would he face any consequences for his behavior? James had stirred the pot, but the outcome was far from certain. The challenges ahead were daunting, but James knew he couldn't walk away now. The next morning, James arrived early, determined to continue his undercover mission. He felt the weight of the previous day's events pressing on him. Todd's collapse, the tense standoff with Dan and Rebecca, and the subtle but growing tension among the staff. He knew he had shaken things up, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. The store was quiet, with only a few employees preparing for the day ahead. James headed straight to the break room, hoping to observe some unfiltered conversations before the shift officially started. He found Dan sitting at a table, scrolling on his phone, while Emily nervously prepared a cup of coffee. The silence between them was thick, and James could sense Emily's discomfort. "Rough day yesterday, huh?" James said casually, breaking the silence as he poured himself a cup of coffee. Dan snorted, not looking up from his phone. "Yeah, thanks to people who don't know how to mind their business." Emily flinched slightly but didn't say anything. James leaned against the counter, keeping his tone light. "Seems like Todd's collapse shook everyone up." Dan shrugged. "Guy's been running himself ragged. Not my problem." James raised an eyebrow. "You don't think the way this place is managed might have something to do with that?" Dan finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. "What's your deal, anyway? You've been poking around here like you own the place." James shrugged, keeping his expression neutral. "Just trying to understand how things work here." Dan rolled his eyes. "Yeah, well, you're not going to fix anything. People like you think they can come in and change the world, but this is just a job. You do what you're told, and you don't ask questions." James let the words hang in the air for a moment, then turned to Emily. "What do you think, Emily? Do you feel like you can speak up when something's wrong?" Emily hesitated, glancing nervously at Dan. I don't know. I guess it depends." James nodded, reading between the lines. "That's fair. It's not always easy to speak up, especially if you're worried about how people will react." Dan scoffed. "See? Even she gets it. People don't come here to change the world. They come here to get a paycheck." Later that morning, James positioned himself near the customer service desk, observing Rebecca as she interacted with the team. She seemed more subdued than the day before, her usual sharpness replaced by a guarded demeanor. James couldn't tell if Todd's collapse had rattled her or if their confrontation had left a mark. "Rebecca," James called out as she passed by. "Can I ask you something?" Rebecca stopped, her expression wary. "What is it? What's your plan for supporting the staff after everything that's happened?" James asked. "It seems like morale's pretty low." Rebecca's jaw tightened. "That's not really your concern, is it?" James smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but as someone who cares about this store, I think it's worth asking." Rebecca stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. "Look, I don't have time to babysit everyone. We're short-staffed, sales are down, and corporate's breathing down my neck. If you think you can do a better job, be my guest." James resisted the urge to reveal his true identity. Instead, he said, "I'm just saying that people work better when they feel valued." "Maybe that's something to think about." Rebecca didn't reply, but the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes told James his words had landed. That afternoon, James noticed Mrs. Thompson helping a teenage girl in the school supplies aisle. The girl seemed shy, her eyes darting nervously as she picked out a notebook. "Are you sure this is the right one?" the girl asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Thompson smiled warmly. "It's perfect, sweetheart. And don't worry, we'll find a pen to match." James watched the interaction with a sense of pride. Mrs. Thompson embodied everything he had hoped his employees would be: kind, patient, and genuinely invested in the customers. But as he turned to leave, he overheard two employees whispering nearby. "Why does she even bother?" one of them said. "She's not getting a raise for being nice." "Yeah," the other replied. "She's probably just trying to suck up to management." James's chest tightened. It was clear that the toxic culture wasn't just coming from the top. It had seeped into the mindset of some of the employees as well. He knew he had to dig deeper to understand the root of the problem. As the day wound down, James decided to check in with the security guard who had handled the shoplifting incident the day before. The guard, whose name tag read Mike, was stationed near the entrance, greeting customers with a friendly nod. "Hey, Mike," James said, leaning against the counter. "Got a minute?" "Sure," Mike replied, his tone relaxed. "What's on your mind?" "I've been noticing a lot of tension around here," James said. "What's your take on it?" Mike chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't need me to tell you this place is a mess. Management's all over the place, and the employees are either overworked or don't care. Why do you think that is?" James asked. Mike shrugged. "Rebecca's more focused on numbers than people, and Dan? Well, you've seen how he is. They set the tone, and everyone else just follows." James nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think it can change?" Mike's expression softened. "I don't know. I've been here long enough to see things go downhill, but I still believe it's possible. It's just going to take the right kind of leadership." As James prepared to leave for the day, he noticed Dan lingering near the stockroom, talking to another employee in hushed tones. Something about their body language seemed off. Furtive glances, lowered voices, and quick movements. James's curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to hang back, pretending to browse a nearby shelf. "What's the big deal?" the other employee whispered. "It's not like anyone's going to find out. Just keep your mouth shut," Dan hissed. "We've got a good thing going, and I'm not letting some nosy idiot ruin it." James's pulse quickened. What were they hiding? He knew he had to tread carefully, but his gut told him this was more than just workplace gossip. Whatever was going on, it could be the key to unraveling the deeper issues plaguing the store. What secret was Dan hiding, and how far would he go to protect it? Could James uncover the truth without blowing his cover? The stakes were rising, and James knew he was about to step into dangerous territory. James's mind raced as he watched Dan and the other employee disappear into the stockroom. The conversation he overheard hinted at something more than simple workplace frustration. This was a deeper issue, possibly one that could explain the toxic atmosphere permeating the store. He knew he needed to investigate, but he couldn't risk being caught snooping. James decided to bide his time and see if he could gather more information without drawing suspicion. He wandered to the front of the store, his thoughts tangled as he mulled over his next steps. The opportunity presented itself sooner than he expected. During the mid-morning lull, he noticed Dan stepping outside for a smoke break. James seized the chance and slipped toward the stockroom. The door was slightly ajar, and the faint hum of machinery masked his movements. Inside, the air was cooler, filled with the smell of cardboard and cleaning supplies. Stacks of boxes lined the walls, and in the far corner, James spotted a makeshift workstation with a laptop, a few clipboards, and scattered papers. He cautiously approached, scanning the area for anything that might explain the cryptic conversation he overheard. A clipboard caught his attention. It contained a handwritten list of inventory items, some marked with asterisks and notes that read "adjusted" or "hold for approval." James frowned, his instincts telling him something wasn't right. Why would inventory adjustments require secrecy? Before he could dig deeper, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. James quickly replaced the clipboard and stepped back, pretending to be searching for something on a nearby shelf. Dan appeared in the doorway, his expression hardening when he saw James. "What are you doing back here?" James turned casually, feigning confusion. "Oh, sorry. I was looking for the restroom and got turned around." Dan narrowed his eyes, clearly unconvinced. "The restroom's at the front of the store. You're not supposed to be back here, right?" "My mistake," James said with a sheepish smile. He moved past Dan, feeling the man's suspicious gaze follow him all the way out of the stockroom. James spent the rest of the day piecing together what little information he had gathered. He suspected some kind of inventory manipulation was taking place, possibly theft or fraud, but without concrete evidence, it was just a hunch. He knew he couldn't confront Dan directly, not without risking his cover. Instead, he decided to observe more closely and see if anyone else might inadvertently reveal clues. He struck up conversations with other employees, casually steering the topics toward inventory and operations. Emily was the first to provide an interesting lead. "Dan handles a lot of the inventory stuff," she said when James asked about how the store tracked stock. "He's always in the stockroom, but I don't know what he does back there. He gets mad if anyone tries to help. Isn't that unusual?" James asked. "Wouldn't it make sense to have a system everyone understands?" Emily shrugged. "I guess, but Dan's been here forever. No one really questions him." James thanked her, his suspicions growing. It seemed Dan had positioned himself as the gatekeeper of the stockroom, keeping others in the dark about his activities. But was Rebecca aware of this, or was she turning a blind eye? As the day wore on, James noticed another odd detail. Mrs. Thompson, who had been working tirelessly to keep the store running smoothly, seemed to be avoiding the stockroom altogether. When James casually mentioned it, her expression shifted to one of discomfort. "I don't go back there unless I have to," she said, lowering her voice. "Dan doesn't like it when people poke around." "Why not?" James asked, keeping his tone light. Mrs. Thompson hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "Between you and me, I think there's something fishy going on back there. But I'm just here to do my job. I don't want any trouble." James nodded, grateful for her honesty. It was clear that others had noticed Dan's behavior, but fear of retaliation kept them silent. The toxic culture was feeding itself, creating an environment where people were too intimidated to speak up. That evening, as James prepared to leave, he noticed Rebecca standing near the registers, her face tight with stress. He decided to approach her, hoping to probe for more information. "Long day?" he asked, his tone casual. Rebecca sighed. "You have no idea. Seems like there's a lot on your plate," James said. "Anything I can help with?" Rebecca gave him a wary look. "Why are you so interested in how this store runs?" James shrugged. "I just think it's an interesting place. Lots of moving parts, lots of people working hard. It's a shame things seem so tense." Rebecca exhaled sharply, her shoulders sagging slightly. "It's not easy, you know. Keeping this place running with all the pressure from corporate, employees who don't pull their weight, and other issues." "Other issues?" James pressed gently. Rebecca hesitated, then shook her head. "Forget I said anything. It's nothing." But James could see the flicker of unease in her eyes. She knew more than she was letting on. Just as James was about to leave, a loud crash echoed from the back of the store. He turned to see an employee running out of the stockroom, her face pale. "Someone needs to get back there, now," she shouted, her voice shaking. James didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the stockroom, his heart pounding. When he arrived, he found Dan standing in the middle of a chaotic scene. Boxes were scattered across the floor, and in the corner, a young employee, barely out of high school, was crumpled on the ground, clutching his arm in pain. "What happened?" James demanded. Dan looked up, his face a mix of anger and panic. He wasn't supposed to be back here. He wasn't paying attention, and the shelves collapsed. James knelt beside the injured employee, who was trembling and trying to hold back tears. "It's okay," James said softly. "We'll get you help." But as James glanced around the stockroom, his eyes landed on something odd, a crate half hidden behind the fallen shelves. It was labeled with a different store's name, and the logo wasn't Walker's. His suspicions solidified. Whatever Dan was hiding, it was bigger than he had imagined. What was the strange crate doing in the stockroom? Was it part of the inventory manipulation James suspected? And how far would Dan go to protect his secret? The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the picture was still unclear, and James knew he was running out of time to figure it out. James's eyes locked on the crate, its logo standing out like a neon sign against the chaos of the stockroom. He leaned slightly to get a better view, but Dan quickly stepped in front of it, blocking his line of sight. "Stay out of it," Dan snapped, his tone dripping with hostility. James straightened, his face calm but his mind racing. "I was just trying to help. That kid's hurt. Don't you think we should focus on that first?" Dan hesitated, glancing at the young employee, who was now wincing in pain. "Fine. Someone call an ambulance," he muttered, waving dismissively. James stepped back, knowing now wasn't the time to push further. But the image of that crate was seared into his mind. He was certain it didn't belong there, and its presence only deepened his suspicions about what Dan was hiding. The ambulance arrived quickly, and the injured employee was carefully loaded onto a stretcher. James stayed close, reassuring the kid that everything would be fine. As the paramedics left, Rebecca appeared, her face tight with concern. "What happened?" she demanded, her eyes darting between James and Dan. "Shelves collapsed," Dan said flatly. "The kid wasn't paying attention." James frowned. "He was doing his job, Dan. Those shelves didn't just collapse on their own. Maybe it's time we take a closer look at what's going on back here." Dan glared at him, his jaw tightening. You don't know what you're talking about. Maybe not, James replied evenly. But accidents like this don't happen in well-run stockrooms. Rebecca's eyes narrowed, her gaze flickering between the two men. Enough, she said finally. Dan, I'll handle this. Go take a break. Dan looked like he wanted to argue, but after a tense moment, he stomped off, muttering under his breath. James turned to Rebecca, his voice low. There's more going on here than you realize. Rebecca folded her arms, her expression guarded. And what exactly do you think you know? I know that crate doesn't belong here, James said, tilting his head toward the corner where the strange crate still sat. Rebecca's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly masked her reaction. It's just an error in shipping. Happens all the time. Does it? James asked, his tone skeptical. Because I've been in a lot of stores, and I've never seen inventory from a different company sitting in the back. Rebecca didn't respond, but the tension in her posture spoke volumes. She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving James standing alone in the stockroom. That night, James stayed late again, pretending to browse while keeping an eye on the employees. He watched as Dan and Rebecca had a hushed conversation near the break room, their body language tense. Dan seemed agitated, his hands gesturing wildly, while Rebecca looked like she was trying to calm him down. James couldn't hear what they were saying, but it was clear they were arguing about something important. He decided to follow Rebecca after she left the store, hoping to glean more information. Rebecca's car pulled out of the parking lot and headed toward the outskirts of town. James kept a safe distance, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he tried to predict her destination. After about 15 minutes, she turned onto a quiet industrial road and pulled into the lot of a rundown warehouse. James parked a block away and approached on foot, his heart pounding. He crouched behind a row of shrubs, watching as Rebecca entered the building through a side door. The warehouse was dark, with only a few dim lights illuminating its exterior. James strained to see through the grimy windows, but couldn't make out much. He debated whether to try getting closer when he noticed another car pulling up. It was Dan. Dan stepped out, carrying a large duffel bag, and headed inside. James's suspicions flared. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't normal business. James crept closer, his pulse racing as he tried to stay out of sight. He found a small crack in one of the warehouse's boarded-up windows and peered inside. The dim interior was filled with shelves of various goods, none of which bore the Walker's brand. Rebecca and Dan were standing near a table covered in papers and boxes. Dan unzipped the duffel bag, revealing stacks of cash bundled tightly with rubber bands. James's stomach dropped. This wasn't just a case of poor management or a toxic work environment. This was criminal. I told you this was risky, Rebecca said, her voice carrying just enough for James to hear. We're fine, Dan replied. No one's on to us. Are you sure about that? Rebecca asked, her tone sharp. Because that guy's been sniffing around all week. Who is he, anyway? James froze, his breath catching in his throat. Some nosy customer, Dan said dismissively. He's harmless. Just a busybody. Rebecca didn't look convinced. If he's harmless, why is he always where he doesn't belong? What if he knows more than he's letting on? James knew he had to leave before they caught him, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. He was finally seeing the full scope of the problem, but he still didn't have enough evidence to confront them. As he began to back away, his foot landed on a loose piece of gravel, sending it skittering across the pavement. The sound echoed in the still night air, and both Rebecca and Dan turned toward the window. Did you hear that? Rebecca whispered. Dan moved toward the door, his hand reaching into his jacket. Stay here. I'll check it out. James's heart raced as he ducked behind a stack of crates near the side of the building. He held his breath, listening as Dan's footsteps grew louder. He knew he was dangerously close to being caught, and if Dan found him, there was no telling what would happen next. What would James do to avoid being discovered? Could he escape unnoticed, or would Dan uncover his presence and confront him? The stakes had never been higher, and James knew that one wrong move could expose his identity and put him in serious danger. James pressed himself against the cold metal crates, his breath shallow as Dan's footsteps grew louder. The night seemed unnaturally quiet, every sound amplified in his ears. He heard the faint creak of the warehouse door swinging open and then the crunch of gravel as Dan stepped outside. "Who's out here?" Dan called, his voice sharp and edged with suspicion. James stayed completely still, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear Dan moving closer, his shadow growing longer in the faint light spilling from the warehouse. James knew he couldn't outrun him without making noise, and he didn't have enough cover to remain unseen for long. His eyes darted around, searching for an escape route. That's when he spotted a stack of pallets leaning precariously against the side of the building. If he could tip them over, it might create a distraction. James reached out slowly, his fingers brushing the edge of the pallets. With a quick push, he sent them toppling over. The loud crash echoed through the lot, and Dan spun toward the noise, his hand flying to his jacket pocket. "Who's there?" Dan shouted, his voice growing angrier. James used the momentary chaos to slip around the side of the building, keeping low as he moved toward the parking lot. His car wasn't far, but he knew he had to be careful. If Dan spotted him, it could all be over. Inside the warehouse, Rebecca's voice rang out. "What's going on out there?" Dan stepped back toward the door, scanning the area one last time before turning to face her. "It's nothing," he said. "Probably just a stray cat or something." Rebecca frowned, clearly unconvinced. "We can't afford any mistakes, Dan. If someone's watching us—" "No one's watching," Dan interrupted. "Relax. We've got this under control." Rebecca didn't look reassured, but she didn't press the issue. "Fine. But if I find out you're wrong, it's on you." Meanwhile, James reached his car, his pulse still racing. He slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, careful to keep his headlights off as he pulled away. Once he was a safe distance from the warehouse, he let out a shaky breath. He had seen enough to confirm his worst fears. Dan and Rebecca weren't just running a poorly managed store. They were running a full-scale operation, using the store as a front for something much bigger. The cash, the mysterious crates, the tension, it all pointed to some kind of illegal activity. But James still didn't know the full extent of their scheme. Were they smuggling goods? Laundering money? Selling stolen inventory? Whatever it was, it had to be tied to the toxic environment at the store. He was certain that uncovering the truth would not only expose Dan and Rebecca, but also help rebuild the culture of the store. The next day, James returned to the store, acting as if nothing had happened. He watched Dan closely, noticing the way he interacted with employees. Dan seemed unusually tense, barking orders and snapping at anyone who got too close to the stockroom. Rebecca, too, was on edge, her usual brisk efficiency replaced with a nervous energy. James decided to subtly test the waters. He approached Emily at the register, keeping his voice low. "Hey, have you noticed anything strange around here lately?" Emily hesitated, glancing around before answering. "Strange how?" "Like, with inventory or the way Dan and Rebecca handle things," James said. "It just seems like there's more going on than meets the eye." Emily bit her lip, her eyes darting to the stockroom. "I mean, I've heard rumors. People say Dan's got some kind of deal going on, but no one really knows what it is." "Rumors like what?" James pressed. "I don't know," Emily said, lowering her voice even further. "Just that he's always disappearing into the stockroom, and sometimes the inventory doesn't match up. But no one wants to get involved. Dan's scary when he's mad." James nodded, his suspicions further confirmed. "Thanks, Emily. You didn't hear this from me, okay?" Emily nodded quickly, clearly relieved to end the conversation. As the day went on, James noticed more signs of the scheme. A delivery truck arrived mid-afternoon, and instead of unloading through the usual entrance, it backed up to a side door near the stockroom. Dan personally oversaw the delivery, refusing help from anyone else. James pretended to be browsing nearby, casually observing the process. The delivery driver handed Dan a clipboard, which Dan signed without hesitation. Then, James noticed something odd. Dan slipped an envelope into the driver's hand before quickly shutting the door. James's heart raced. This wasn't a standard delivery, it was a handoff. That evening, James reviewed everything he had observed. The secretive inventory practices, the crates with the wrong logo, the cash in the warehouse, and now the suspicious delivery. The pieces were falling into place, but he needed proof, something concrete he could take to the authorities. He decided to use his position to dig deeper. As the CEO of Walker Enterprises, he had access to records that could confirm his suspicions. He could review the store's inventory logs, delivery schedules, and financial reports to see if there were discrepancies. But doing so would require revealing his identity, and if Dan or Rebecca caught wind of it before he had enough evidence, they could destroy everything. Just as James was formulating his plan, his phone buzzed with a text from his assistant, Lisa. Update from corporate. All store managers required to attend a regional meeting tomorrow. Thought you'd want to know. James's eyes widened. If Rebecca was at the meeting, it would be the perfect opportunity to access the store's records without interference. He replied quickly, "Thanks, Lisa. I'll handle it." The next day, as Rebecca prepared to leave for the meeting, James stayed behind, blending in with the employees as usual. He knew he had a limited window to act, and he had to be careful. Any misstep could alert Dan, or worse, expose him before he had the evidence he needed. Would James be able to access the records without being caught? And what would he find when he finally uncovered the truth about Dan and Rebecca's operation? The stakes were higher than ever, and James was running out of time. The next morning, James arrived at the store early, ready to execute his plan. With Rebecca attending the regional meeting, the pressure was on. He had only a few hours to investigate before she returned, and Dan's presence would make things even trickier. As the day began, James noticed Dan was in a foul mood, pacing around the stockroom and barking orders at anyone who crossed his path. Whatever pressure he was under seemed to be mounting, and James could feel the tension radiating from him. James had to wait for the right moment. He watched as Dan disappeared into the break room, likely for one of his lengthy coffee breaks. This was his chance. James slipped into the office, which was tucked away in the back corner of the store. It was cramped and cluttered, with stacks of papers, binders, and a computer that looked like it had seen better days. He quickly shut the door behind him and sat at the desk, his heart pounding. The computer was still logged in under Rebecca's account, a stroke of luck that James hadn't anticipated. He navigated to the inventory system, scanning through recent transactions and delivery logs. At first, everything seemed normal. Standard shipments of products, routine restocking, nothing out of the ordinary. But then he noticed a discrepancy. Several shipments were marked as adjusted, with vague notes like manual override and special request. The quantities didn't match the official records, and there were no corresponding sales to account for the missing items. James clicked deeper, pulling up a list of vendors. That's when he saw it, a supplier listed under the name Southern Distribution LLC, a company he didn't recognize. The logo on the invoices matched the crates he had seen in the stockroom. He opened one of the invoices and felt his stomach drop. It was for electronics, high-end headphones, tablets, and even gaming consoles, but the quantities didn't make sense. The store hadn't sold enough of these items to justify the shipments, which meant they were likely being funneled elsewhere. James took out his phone and snapped photos of the screen, documenting everything. He knew this was the proof he needed to expose the operation, but he wasn't done yet. He needed to confirm the connection between Dan and Southern Distribution LLC. As James was digging through more records, he heard the sound of footsteps outside the office. His heart leapt into his throat. He quickly closed the files, leaving the computer as he had found it, and slipped out through the side door just as the main door creaked open. Dan stepped into the office, his eyes narrowing as he looked around. James pressed himself against the wall in the hallway, holding his breath. After a moment, Dan muttered something under his breath and closed the door. James exhaled shakily and made his way back to the main floor, his mind racing. He had gathered valuable evidence, but now he needed a way to link Dan directly to the operation. Later that afternoon, James decided to observe Dan more closely. He noticed that Dan kept disappearing into the stockroom at odd intervals, often carrying a clipboard or a small box. Each time, he would emerge looking tense, scanning the store as if searching for something or someone. James followed him discreetly, pretending to organize shelves nearby. When Dan slipped into the stockroom again, James waited a moment before peeking inside. He saw Dan standing near the suspicious crate, his back turned as he rummaged through a smaller box on top of it. James crept closer, careful not to make a sound. He saw Dan pull out a bundle of cash, count it quickly, and tuck it into his jacket. Then, as if sensing he wasn't alone, Dan spun around. James ducked behind a stack of boxes, his heart racing. He heard Dan mutter something, followed by the sound of the stockroom door closing. When James looked again, Dan was gone. That evening, James decided to take a calculated risk. He approached Mrs. Thompson, who was tidying up near the customer service desk. "Mrs. Thompson," he said quietly, "can I ask you something?" She looked up, her kind eyes narrowing slightly. "Of course, dear. What's on your mind? Do you trust Dan?" James asked bluntly. Mrs. Thompson hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I trust him as far as I can throw him." "Why?" James glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "I think he's involved in something illegal. I've seen things that don't add up, inventory going missing, suspicious deliveries. But I need more proof." Mrs. Thompson's expression softened, and she nodded. "I've suspected for a while, but I didn't want to say anything without evidence. What can I do to help?" James felt a surge of gratitude. "If you see or hear anything unusual, let me know. But please, be careful. I don't want you to get caught up in this." Mrs. Thompson placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Don't worry about me. I've been around long enough to know how to keep my head down." As the store closed for the night, James lingered in the parking lot, waiting for Dan to leave. He noticed Dan locking up the stockroom and heading to his car, carrying what looked like the same duffel bag he had taken to the warehouse. James decided to follow him again, keeping a safe distance as Dan drove out of the lot. This time, Dan headed to a different location, a small, nondescript office building on the edge of town. Dan parked around the back and disappeared inside, carrying the duffel bag. James waited for a few minutes, then crept closer, his instincts screaming that he was about to uncover something big. Through a crack in the blinds, James saw Dan talking to a man in a suit. The two exchanged what appeared to be an envelope and a handshake before Dan handed over the duffel bag. James pulled out his phone and started taking photos, capturing every detail he could. He knew this was the final piece of the puzzle, the link that connected Dan to the larger operation. As James returned to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder but saw nothing. Still, the unease lingered as he drove away, his mind racing with questions. Who was the man in the suit? How deep did this operation go? And would James have enough time to expose everything before Dan or Rebecca figured out what he was doing? The walls were closing in, and James knew the clock was ticking. James didn't sleep much that night. The images he had captured, the envelope exchange, and Dan's suspicious behavior replayed in his mind. He had enough evidence to implicate Dan, but something told him this operation ran deeper than a single warehouse manager skimming from inventory. He needed to connect the dots, and quickly. The following morning, James arrived at the store before it opened, his plan carefully mapped out. He would confront Rebecca, not as a customer, but as the CEO of Walker Enterprises. The time for subtlety had passed. If Rebecca truly had no knowledge of Dan's operation, she might help him. If she was involved, the confrontation would force her hand. The store buzzed with morning activity as employees prepared for the day ahead. Rebecca walked in shortly after 9 a.m., her usual brisk demeanor masking any sign of the previous day's tension. James caught her in the hallway leading to the office. "Rebecca," he said, his voice firm but calm. "We need to talk." Rebecca frowned, clearly surprised by his tone. "About what?" James didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the office. "In private." Rebecca hesitated but eventually nodded, leading him inside. Once the door was closed, James turned to face her. "You're probably wondering who I am," he began, removing his baseball cap. "My name is James Walker. I'm the CEO of this company." Rebecca's eyes widened, and her mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. "I've been undercover in this store for the past week," James continued. "I've seen things that are not only against company policy, but potentially illegal. And I believe you know exactly what I'm talking about." Rebecca's face paled. I don't know what you mean." "Don't play dumb, Rebecca," James said sharply, his patience wearing thin. "I've seen the crates in the stockroom. I've watched Dan handle deliveries that don't match our records. I've seen the money changing hands. If you're not involved, now's the time to come clean." Rebecca swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the desk. "It's not what you think," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then explain it to me," James said, crossing his arms. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you and Dan are running a side operation using company resources." Rebecca sank into her chair, her composure crumbling. "I didn't start it," she admitted. "It was Dan's idea. He's been doing this for years, long before I got here." James's eyes narrowed. "And you went along with it?" Rebecca looked down, ashamed. "He said if I didn't, he'd find a way to pin it on me. He's not someone you want to cross." "Rebecca, you're the assistant manager," James said, his tone softening slightly. "You had the authority to report him. Why didn't you?" Rebecca shook her head. "You don't understand. Dan has connections. Powerful ones. If I said anything, he'd make sure I regretted it." James studied her, weighing her words. He could see the fear in her eyes, the desperation of someone who felt trapped. While she wasn't innocent, it was clear she wasn't the mastermind. "I need your help," James said after a moment. "If we're going to stop this, I need you to tell me everything." Rebecca hesitated, but finally, she nodded. "Okay, I'll tell you what I know." She explained how Dan had started the operation years ago, using fake vendors like Southern Distribution LLC to funnel stolen goods through the store. The warehouse James had discovered was one of several drop points, and the man in the suit was a middleman who helped distribute the goods to buyers. "Why hasn't corporate noticed?" James asked. "Dan's careful," Rebecca replied. "He manipulates the inventory records, makes it look like shrinkage or routine adjustments. And when things don't add up, he blames the employees." James clenched his fists. Dan's scheme wasn't just stealing from the company. It was destroying the morale of the employees and tarnishing everything James had worked to build. As their conversation ended, Rebecca leaned forward, her expression pleading. "What are you going to do?" James met her gaze. "I'm going to put an end to this. But I need you to stay calm and act like nothing's changed. If Dan suspects anything, he'll shut everything down before we can expose him." Rebecca nodded, her face pale but determined. "What do you need me to do?" "For now, just keep an eye on him," James said. "Let me know if he does anything unusual." Later that day, James received a call from his assistant, Lisa. "Sir, I've been digging into Southern Distribution LLC like you asked," she said. "It's a shell company. The address listed for their headquarters is fake." James wasn't surprised, but the confirmation strengthened his resolve. "Thanks, Lisa. I'm going to need you to coordinate with legal and security. I'll send you what I have." "Understood," Lisa said. "And James? Be careful. If this is as big as it sounds, these people won't go down without a fight." James hung up, her words echoing in his mind. He knew she was right. Dan wasn't just a disgruntled employee cutting corners. He was part of a larger network, one that wouldn't hesitate to protect its interests. That evening, James stayed late, watching as Dan locked up the stockroom. He noticed Dan slip another envelope into his pocket, his eyes darting around nervously. James knew the clock was ticking. Would he be able to gather enough evidence to bring Dan down before it was too late? And what would happen if Dan discovered the truth about James's identity? The stakes had never been higher, and the danger was growing with every passing moment. James felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him as he prepared for the next steps. He had enough evidence to expose Dan's operation, but timing was critical. Acting too soon might scare Dan into covering his tracks. Waiting too long risked further damage to the store and its employees. With Rebecca on edge and Lisa coordinating with legal and security, the pieces were in place, but the final move would require precision. The next morning, James entered the store with a sense of purpose. He noticed the staff moving about as usual, but the air felt different, tense, almost like everyone could sense something was brewing. Dan was at the customer service desk, barking orders and wearing his usual scowl, but James caught the occasional flicker of unease in his expression. Rebecca approached James near the stockroom, her voice low. "Dan's been acting strange. He's been in and out of the stockroom all morning, and he's already had 2 private meetings with delivery drivers." James nodded. "He's probably feeling the heat. We need to keep him on edge without tipping him off." Rebecca glanced over her shoulder. "What's the plan?" I've coordinated with corporate security, James said. They're sending a team to audit the inventory records in the stockroom this afternoon. When they get here, I'll confront Dan. We'll catch him red-handed. Rebecca's face paled. And if he figures out what's happening before they get here, then we make sure he doesn't get the chance to cover his tracks, James replied. As the morning wore on, James kept a close eye on Dan. He noticed Dan spending more time than usual in the stockroom, often emerging with a phone pressed to his ear and a tight expression on his face. James suspected he was coordinating with his associates, possibly planning an exit strategy. At one point, James saw Dan hand an envelope to one of the delivery drivers. The driver hesitated, looking around nervously, before slipping the envelope into his pocket and quickly leaving the store. James made a mental note of the driver's license plate and texted the details to Lisa. "Track this driver," he wrote. "He might lead us to the larger operation." Lisa's reply was swift. "On it." By early afternoon, the corporate security team arrived. They were dressed in plain clothes to avoid drawing attention, blending in as customers while they prepared for the audit. James greeted them in the parking lot, briefing them on the plan. "We need to go in quietly," James said. "Dan's suspicious, and if he catches wind of what we're doing, he'll shut everything down. Start with the inventory records and cross-check them against the stockroom. I'll keep him occupied." The team nodded, their expressions serious. "Got it. We'll move fast." Inside the store, James approached Dan near the stockroom. "Hey, Dan," he said casually. "Got a minute?" Dan looked up, his expression guarded. "What do you want?" "I was just wondering about those deliveries we've been getting," James said. "You've been handling them personally, right?" Dan's eyes narrowed. "Why do you care?" "Just curious," James replied with a shrug. "Seems like you've got a lot on your plate." Dan snorted. "Yeah, well, someone's got to keep this place running. Not that it's any of your business." James smiled faintly. "Fair enough. Keep up the good work." As James walked away, he saw Dan glance toward the stockroom, his brow furrowing. It was clear he was feeling the pressure. Meanwhile, the security team worked quickly, combing through the inventory records and cross-referencing them with the physical stock. It didn't take long for discrepancies to surface. Items listed as sold or damaged were still sitting in the stockroom, while other items were completely unaccounted for. One of the security team members texted James, "We've found enough to implicate him. Ready when you are." James read the message, his heart pounding. It was time to confront Dan. James found Dan in the stockroom, hunched over a crate with his phone in hand. "Dan," James said, his voice firm. "We need to talk." Dan looked up, his face a mix of annoyance and suspicion. "What now?" James stepped closer, his expression serious. "I know what you've been doing." Dan's eyes flickered with panic, but he quickly masked it with anger. "I don't know what you're talking about." James held up his phone, showing the photos he had taken of the warehouse, the envelopes, and the suspicious deliveries. "You've been using this store as a front for your operation. The fake vendors, the stolen goods, the cash deals. I've seen it all." Dan's face turned red. "You don't have proof." "Actually, I do," James replied. "Corporate security is here, and they've already uncovered the evidence." "It's over, Dan." Dan's hand clenched into a fist, and for a moment, James thought he might lash out. But instead, Dan smirked, his demeanor shifting. "You think this ends with me?" Dan said, his voice low and menacing. "You have no idea who you're messing with." "Maybe not," James said, holding his ground. "But I know enough to stop you." Dan took a step closer, his voice dripping with defiance. "You think you're the hero here? This isn't some movie. You have no idea how deep this goes." Before James could respond, one of the security team members entered the stockroom. "We've called the police," the man said. "They're on their way." Dan's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of fear. He glanced around, as if searching for an escape route, but the stockroom was surrounded. The next moments were a blur. The police arrived quickly, taking Dan into custody while James watched from the sidelines. As Dan was escorted out of the store, he locked eyes with James, his expression dark. "This isn't over," Dan said, his voice cold. James didn't flinch. "Yes, it is." After the chaos settled, James addressed the staff. revealing his identity and explaining what had happened. The employees were shocked, but the sense of relief was palpable. For the first time in months, the store felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. James ended his speech with a promise. This store is more than just a business, it's a community. And starting today, we're going to rebuild that community together. But as James left the store that evening, he couldn't shake Dan's parting words. Was the operation truly over, or had he only scratched the surface of a larger conspiracy? The battle might have been won, but James knew the war was far from over. The store was quieter the next day. Without Dan looming over the staff, the atmosphere felt noticeably different. Employees worked with a cautious optimism, as though they were still processing the fallout from the previous day. Rebecca, who had been instrumental in helping James gather information, seemed lighter, less tense, though still visibly shaken by the events. James arrived early to meet with the corporate security team and the police, who were conducting a follow-up investigation. The evidence they had gathered from the stockroom and the inventory system was enough to charge Dan with multiple counts of fraud, theft, and embezzlement. The middleman from the warehouse had also been apprehended, thanks to the information James provided. As James walked through the store, he paused to speak with employees. Emily, the young cashier, seemed more confident than he had ever seen her. "Are you feeling better about working here?" James asked, his tone warm. Emily nodded. "It's already different. People aren't afraid to talk anymore. And thanks for standing up for us. No one's ever done that before." James smiled. "You deserve to work in a place where you're respected. That's what we're building now." Mrs. Thompson approached, her kind eyes sparkling. "I've seen a lot in my years here, but I never thought I'd see a day like this. You've given us hope, Mr. Walker." James shook her hand, his gratitude evident. "You've been the heart of this store, Mrs. Thompson. Thank you for everything you've done." Later that afternoon, Rebecca called James into the office. She had been quiet since Dan's arrest, and James knew she was grappling with her role in the operation. "I want to apologize," Rebecca said, her voice trembling slightly. "I should have done more. I should have stopped him." "You made a mistake," James said gently, "but you also helped make things right. That takes courage." Rebecca nodded, her eyes welling up. "Thank you for giving me a second chance. I won't let you down." "I believe you," James replied. "And if you're ready to move forward, I think you can be part of rebuilding this store." Rebecca's expression softened, relief washing over her face. "I'm ready." In the days that followed, James worked closely with the corporate team to implement new policies that would prevent future corruption. He introduced mandatory audits, better oversight of inventory processes, and anonymous reporting channels for employees. But more importantly, he focused on rebuilding trust within the team. He held a meeting with the entire staff, sharing his vision for the store's future. "This isn't just about fixing what went wrong," James said. "It's about creating a place where everyone feels valued, employees and customers alike. That's what Walker Enterprises is all about." The employees responded with a standing ovation, their renewed enthusiasm filling the room. For the first time in a long while, they felt like they were part of something bigger than just a job. On his final day at the store, James took a moment to reflect. He stood near the front entrance, watching as customers and employees interacted with a sense of ease and camaraderie that had been missing for too long. Lisa called him with an update. "The investigation's wrapped up," she said. "Dan and his associates are facing serious charges, and the stolen goods are being recovered." "You did it, James." James sighed, a mix of relief and satisfaction washing over him. "We did it, Lisa. It took a team to make this happen." As he hung up, James noticed Emily helping a customer find a product, her smile genuine and welcoming. Mrs. Thompson was chatting with a regular customer, her warmth evident. Rebecca was in the background, directing the team with confidence. The store was finally becoming the community James had always envisioned. As he stepped outside, James felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. He had walked into this store undercover, expecting to see the usual challenges of retail, but what he found had been far more complex. The journey had tested his patience, courage, and leadership, but in the end, it had been worth every moment. Dan's words still echoed faintly in the back of his mind. "This isn't over." But James wasn't worried. He knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them. With a final glance at the store, James smiled and walked away, confident that he had made a lasting difference, not just in the business, but in the lives of the people who worked there.